Expectation is a big word. Its lofty connotations lurk in all corners of entertainment, but particularly so, it seems, in the world of video games. After all, these things take a long time to make, so there's plenty of time for players to clarify their vision of what they want to experience. This pressure is only intensified when sequels are introduced to the conversation. The Evil Within 2 is one such sequel, following up one of my favorite games of all time and the focus of my first video on this channel. Released in October 2017, 3 years after the original, The Evil Within 2 elicited more anticipation from me than perhaps any other game of the last generation. Expectation looms as heavily as the dangers. Can The Evil Within 2 possibly bear the weight? Sebastian Castellanos has seen better days. It's hard to blame him after the horrors he witnessed 3 years earlier in The Evil Within 1, but trauma further burdens him after the tragic death of his daughter Lily and the subsequent separation from his wife Myra. It's all too much to bear for the retired police officer who's turned to the bottle to keep his pain at bay. Of course, a video game protagonist only has so much time to wallow in self-pity. During one of his late nights at the bar, Sebastian is visited by none other than Julie Kidman, his old partner and uneasy ally. She reveals that Lily is in fact very much alive, but trapped in STEM, the simulated reality that Sebastian escaped in the first game. STEM is being controlled by Mobius, the seedy organization for which Kidman is an agent. Mobius has been using Lily as the core for STEM, but they've lost contact, meaning that the world inside is doomed to fall apart without intervention. Determined to find and save his daughter, Sebastian heads back into STEM, this time willingly. The story of The Evil Within 2 is a much more intimate tale than that of its predecessor. In The Evil Within 1, Seb felt more like a vessel used to show the player the twisted reality of STEM, with any mention of his family delivered through optional documents. As I mentioned when I covered that game, he hardly felt like a character. Sebastian is much more at the core of the narrative this time around, and feels more fleshed out, but unfortunately, still fails to be very compelling. For most of the game, he's got a one-track mind, disinterested in anything spoken to him that doesn't pertain to Lily. It makes total sense that he'd be focused on finding his daughter, but when Sebastian gruffly dismisses yet another character, it's hard not to roll your eyes. He's also voiced by a new actor this time around, which is an unavoidably distracting change.
A soldier would have taken the safety off.
Along with Sebastian, a group of Mobius agents are also trapped inside STEM, forming the game's primary cast. They serve as friend and foe, but also fail to leave much of an impression. The story of The Evil Within 1 wasn't one of its strong suits, which Tango Gameworks clearly attempted to rectify here, but they fall short. The writing is once again weak, and the cast forgettable. Even the game's villains fail to make much of an impression, although the twisted artwork of the murderous Stefano will likely stick with you long after the credits roll. The biggest issue with The Evil Within 2's narrative is its intrusive nature. Yes, the original game featured plentiful cutscenes, but most of the time, you were left to explore the world at your own pace. The Evil Within 2 is much chattier, with Seb often interrupted by Kidman or an agent on his newly acquired communicator. The game's loquacious nature dampens both its pace and atmosphere. It's a game that pushes a lot of prose and would have been better off letting Sebastian get the job done in peace.
Fuck!
That peace is relative, of course, as once again, you'll be contending with innumerable monstrosities as you make your way deeper and deeper into STEM. Lead persists as the most effective form of communication, much to the chagrin of your antagonists. Sebastian slowly gains access to a similar arsenal to that of the first game, a standard handgun, shotgun, sniper rifle, and crossbow, with a couple of unique additions picked up in the last act. Each weapon handles as you'd expect, and overall, the gunplay here feels tighter than it did in The Evil Within 1. A game's feel is always a struggle to articulate in words, but rest assured, nailing a headshot carries all of the satisfaction you'd hope for. Despite the improved nature of combat Enemies are agile enough that hitting your mark is just as challenging as it's ever been, which feels appropriate for a survival horror game. Also in line with horror expectations is the scarcity of resources. In the early goings, methodical investigation of every last drawer is essentially required for progression. Ammo in particular is a rare commodity, replaced often by gunpowder, a new item introduced in the series. Gunpowder can be used to craft ammunition of any weapon type. The Evil Within 1 featured optional crafting of the crossbow's ammunition, but now Sebastian can create bullets and shells alike. This expanded system provides more flexibility with regard to which weapons you want to focus on using, but also permisses the game to provide far less ready-made ammunition. Seb can craft ammo at any time, but if you're willing to hoard your supplies until you stumble onto one of the game's many crafting tables, you can create resources for a lower gunpowder cost. This do-it-yourself approach also expands to healing items, which can be crafted from collectible herbs. Another expanded mechanic present is the upgrade system. Just like in the first game, Sebastian can find green gel, often dropped by defeated enemies, to improve his baseline stats. Upgrades focus on his health, stamina, combat, and stealth capabilities. Many passive increases are the same as before, such as maximum health or sprint duration, but Part 2 features some interesting new additions that alter how Sebastian plays, such as the ability to temporarily slow down time when in combat. Your weapon stats can also be improved, but are now interestingly tied to a different currency. Weapon parts are tucked around the world and exist independently from green gel. To make matters even more interesting, both Sebastian and weapon upgrades feature yet another currency in the form of red gel and high-grade weapon parts, respectively. These additional collectibles unlock higher tiers of each skill tree, meaning that if you lack the necessary red gel, for example, you won't be able to unlock a high-tier ability even with the required amount of green gel. All of these different items can feel a bit overwhelming at first, but ultimately, it doesn't really affect progression in a meaningful way. It's nice not to have to choose between improving Sebastian and his weapons, but this change in approach kind of feels like fixing something that wasn't broken. All enhancements are once again applied in a safe area accessed through mirrors. This time around, the safe zone resembles Sebastian's old police office instead of Beacon Mental Hospital. It functions identically to its Evil Within 1 counterpart, although it now features an addictive shooting gallery mode that unlocks items for the main game. When upgrading Sebastian, you can also reconvene with creepy nurse Tatiana, returning with her odd affect and supply-filled lockers that are once again accessible with keys hidden throughout the game. There's something particularly cozy about a small hub of safety juxtaposed with a brutally dangerous world, so it's a relief to see such a place return here.
This place. It's just like Beacon. But this isn't Beacon. This is Union.
Is it? It all seems familiar to me.
Brutal really is an apt description of the Evil Within 2. Particularly in the earlier chapters, you'll be consistently humbled by an axe to the face or a shoe to the head. With supplies limited, stealth becomes an important option. You could perform sneak kills in the first game, but stealth plays an even greater role here, with an entire skill tree dedicated to its progression. It's a tense mechanic, as enemies often turn around to face you just before the kill prompt appears. You certainly don't have to play stealthily if you don't want to, but a louder approach will inevitably lead to wasted ammo and copious retreat. Without question, the single biggest change to the Evil Within 2 is its structure. Initially, it appears similar, but a couple of hours into the game, Sebastian arrives at an area resembling a small town, complete with homes and businesses alike. This section is an open hub, able to be explored in whatever order you see fit. There's a key location that will progress the story, but you're free to wander as long as you'd like before moving forward. The Evil Within 1 featured some larger areas, less linear in nature, but this newfound freedom will likely come as a surprise. The larger space has prompted Tango to introduce some more traditional elements of the Evil Within 2's contemporaries. You're now equipped with a map, complete with waypoints that's slowly unclouded as you visit more locations. The communicator that Sebastian uses to make calls also comes into play here, functioning as a compass of sorts, pointing you in the right direction of various points of interest as you explore. These are surprising additions that ultimately strip the game of what makes the survival horror genre special. I'm not opposed to a more open structure for a game of this nature, but the Evil Within 2 doesn't execute it well. By providing the player with a map, Tango enables itself to create its environment with less care. It no longer has to craft a space that conveys information to the player organically. Now, if the player isn't sure where to go, they can just consult their map instead of really getting to know the level at hand. This certainly isn't to say that the presence of a map in any given game indicates the quality of its level design, but compared to the carefully crafted world of The Evil Within 1, these new hub areas feel less inspired. These issues are exacerbated by the communicator, which ends up feeling like another intrusive crutch that cheapens exploration.
What do you want?
In some ways, it feels like The Evil Within 2 attempts to walk back its survival horror identity, perhaps as a response to criticism of its predecessor. These adjustments to the structure and tools at your disposal partially rob the game of the isolated, immersive cadence of The Evil Within 1. It's a bit of an identity crisis, but that's not to say the game abandons its roots. It's still a faithful sequel in many ways, most notably with regard to its difficulty. The larger environments may provide more freedom, but there are still plenty of dangers lurking around most corners to mandate a measured pace, including special enemy types that take some extra firepower to fell. It's important to note that these more open sections only compose a fraction of the game. For the most part, particularly in the latter half of the game's 15 chapters, The Evil Within 2 is a more straightforward, linear experience. Despite this fact, a serious pacing issue persists. Whether it's another rigid conversation with an NPC, a prolonged section with little to no enemies, or forced stealth segments initiated by a Ju-on-esque woman capable of killing Sebastian in one hit, The Evil Within 2 often gets in its own way. Many will likely prefer the variation in gameplay, but I'm vastly preferential to the more consistent rhythm of The Evil Within 1. Even when Part 2 begins to lean more into Sebastian's maiden voyage, it still misses the mark. The fact of the matter is, The Evil Within 2's atmosphere simply can't compete.
What in the hell?
Atmosphere is a bizarre concept, a fact that I've spoken about previously. It's a largely subjective phenomenon, one that I'm particularly sensitive to. Why do I think the atmosphere in this game is so inferior to what came before? Well, the interruptive elements I've already discussed don't help, but beyond that, well, it's just a feeling. The sensation of slowly combing through the nocturnal forests in The Evil Within 1 is a macabre joy unrivaled for me by anything in The Evil Within 2. Maybe it's related to the time of my life when I played the first game relative to the second. Whatever the reason may be, I'd rather plug into Part 1's corner of STEM any day of the week. To be fair, The Evil Within 2's world presents just as much twisted imagery and horrid foes as you'd hope. There's a deeper mythology baked into STEM this time around, a much grander scope, so much so that it begins to feel silly that the solution to all of its evils is a washed-up cop with a shotgun. Environmental variety is strong, and the hope of one more helping of green gel consistently pulls you towards each nook and cranny. It's abundantly clear that despite its inferiority, The Evil Within 2 is made with love and care. It certainly runs much better than the first game, which is commendable, but it also ditches the unique grindhouse aesthetic, which for my money is a loss.
Your daughter is lost because of you.
This all brings us back to that grandiose word, expectation. My first playthrough of The Evil Within 2 was met with perhaps the most potent disappointment I'd ever experienced in a video game. In hindsight, how could it not let me down? My expectations were sky high, built up by The Evil Within 1, a game that many categorize as mediocre. I anticipated this video would be scathing in nature, a condemnation of this sequel and all its flaws. Instead, my second playthrough of The Evil Within 2 brought epiphany. I realized that I'd been too hard on the game. The significant drop in my expectations cleared my bias enough to see that the game is better than I initially gave it credit for. The Evil Within 2 possesses numerous redeemable qualities, and it's entirely possible that you may enjoy it more than its predecessor. My altered perspective doesn't change the fact that I'm very disappointed in The Evil Within 2. That fact will likely never change, but my re-examination has further illustrated the value of treating each game as its own experience. It shows that in shedding our almighty expectations, we just might set ourselves up for far greater enjoyment.
Fear radiates from you. It's beautiful, but not yet finished.